Yeah, I'll make it brief. So David will welcome Adam in a second. I welcome everyone as the director of the Center for Religion and Global Citizenry. So we'll do a lot of work with undergraduates, but we also run the IRG, the Interdisciplinary Religion Group, which is a platform at UW-Madison for faculty and graduate students. And of course, since Ethan is here, for all gifted, not yet graduate students with an interest in religion. And what we want to do when we started this a few years ago, we want to bring people together who work in the area of religion or whose work has something to do with religion. Essentially, we wanted to create a community for people like us so that we can discuss work in progress, introduce things we just published or about to publish, and have other people's thoughts and reflections on that work. This year, so I'm not having in mind 2021, but for the last year, 2020 and 2021, it's been very good, especially because we have David now at the center, who also has a vested interest in what we are doing. And I'm glad that he will introduce our speaker today, Adam Stern. And with that, welcome everyone again. And David, you got the floor.
Great. So I'm thinking that since we're a small group here, it might be worthwhile for us to introduce ourselves. I know not everyone knows each other, and it's within time constraints. I think it's achievable. Yeah, so I'm David. I coordinate programs here at the center. Ulrich just spoke as the director. Yeah, if you want to, I'll just call on people. If people want to chime in who they are, their institutional affiliation, where they live here at the university, or if they don't. And yeah, I think we can just do that. So Carl, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Carl Rasmussen. I'm an attorney in private practice in Madison. I do have a doctorate from UW. And 4 years ago, I published a book on John Calvin called Monstrous Fictions, Reflections on John Calvin in a Time of Culture War. I'm involved in several projects with the Wisconsin Council of Churches, one of which David is also involved in. And I think, David, we're having a meeting tomorrow, and I'm not sure I have the Zoom link, but we'll leave that for later.
Thanks, Carl. Brandon.
Hi, I'm Brandon Flock. It's nice to meet those of you who I haven't met in person yet. I started here in the fall as an assistant professor in the history department, and I work on post-war Germany in particular, looking at the role of Protestant intellectuals in the reconstruction of constitutional democracy after World War II. So I'm very much interested in kind of the themes that this group works on, and I think I'll be talking later in the semester. So I'm really just glad that Ulrich put together that this kind of community exists here.
Sky.
I'm Sky Doney, and I'm the director of the George L. Massey program in history, normally just down the hall from Ulrich.
Good to have you here. Killian.
Hi, my name is Killian Harre. I'm a 6th-year PhD student in the history department, training in early modern and revolutionary European history, and my dissertation is on Catholic pilgrimage in the French Revolutionary era.
And Hank.
Hi, I'm Hank Southgate. I teach philosophy in the philosophy department. I specialize in 19th and 20th century German. And I also am the managing editor of the Journal of the History of Philosophy. Glad to be here.
Good to have you. Hank was one of my instructors when I was an undergrad here. So prized, cherished. Good to have you here. Ethan.
Hi, my name is Ethan Dickler. I'm an undergraduate studying English literature and European studies here at UW-Madison. I am an interfaith fellow this year, and I'm currently in one of Dr. Stern's classes. So yeah.
Thanks for being here, Ethan. I'll introduce our speaker for today, and you can say anything else you'd like, Adam, after I'm done. But Adam Stern, presenting today, he joined the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic Studies, as well as the Center for Jewish Studies here at UW-Madison in 2019. Before coming here, he previously held a position as a postdoctoral associate in the Whitney Humanities Center and program for the study of anti-Semitism at Yale University. He received his PhD in the study of religion from Harvard University in 2017. Adam's research focuses on the overlapping fields of modern European intellectual history, philosophy of religion, and Jewish thought. These fields are traversed in his forthcoming book, Survival, a Theological-Political Genealogy, which will be published with the University of Pennsylvania Press in March, I believe, if it doesn't keep getting pushed back, Adam, but you said March. This book and a specific chapter from it are the subject of your talk today, so I need not say much more. Please join me in welcoming our speaker for today, Adam Stern. Little Zoom applause for you.
Thanks very much, David, for the invitation and the kind introduction. Yeah, so I sent around, I don't know if everyone had a chance to read it, but I sent around an article. It's actually a few years old now, but it forms part of one chapter in the book. And I'm not going to talk about it a great deal. I thought it would be a little bit technical to give a kind of 35-minute presentation on Franz Rosenzweig, who I imagine not everyone has spent a lot of time with. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the book in general, and then I'll just briefly talk a little bit about Rosenzweig as a kind of central figure in it. And then hopefully, if I don't drag on too long, we can have a little discussion about some of the themes and so forth. So I'm just as a kind of guide to the presentation, I'm going to share my screen with all of you. It's kind of a quick PowerPoint I put together just to kind of guide you through the presentation. So this is the cover anyway. So the central question that I ask in the book is, who is speaking about survival? Maybe a deceptively simple question. And one is tempted, or at least I think there has been a temptation to begin by looking at a famous archive of beginnings, namely the book that begins in the beginning, the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrew Bible seems, in fact, to have no trouble speaking about survival. In the book of Genesis, Joseph says to his brothers, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. Later, in the book of Exodus, God establishes the rules and ordinances governing the practice of slavery. When a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment. The book of Numbers eventually recounts the Israelites' conquest of Canaan and their decimation of the Amorite king Og. So they killed him and his sons and all his people until there was no survivor left. It is a story that the book of Deuteronomy repeats in almost identical terms, and one that the book of Joshua echoes in its description of another Israelite campaign against the people and city of Ai. Israel struck them down until no one was left who survived or escaped. Altogether, variations of the verb to survive appear no less than 50 times across the text of the Hebrew Bible, be it in the book of Judges, Kings, Joel, and Obadiah, or in Zephaniah, Job, Lamentations, and Ezra. The most well-known examples come from later prophets like Ezekiel, where God's judgment turns toward Israel. Isaiah declares, if the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. God says to Jeremiah, the people who survived the sword found grace in the wilderness. When Israel sought for rest, the Lord appeared to him from far away. Right. As for Nehemiah, he worries from exile about the state of his people. I asked them about the Jews that survived, those who had escaped the captivity, and about Jerusalem. They replied, the survivors there in the province who escaped captivity are in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been destroyed by fire. These scattered citations hardly amount to an exhaustive account of the meaning and significance of the Hebrew Bible's survival talk. But even such a restricted catalog should be enough to register the biblical beginnings, or as I'll come to in a minute, the apparent biblical beginnings and archaic origins of an entire theological political tradition focused on the primordial affinity between survival and the Jews, not to mention the mystery of Jewish survival through the ages. The history has been told in a variety of overlapping and sometimes conflicting ways. Many point to the Talmud and its concern with the eternality of Israel. Others focus on the reception of the rabbinic dictum, Afal pi shechata Yisraeluhu, though he sinned in Israelite, he remains. There are those who recount the aftermath of the temple's destruction, those who read Maimonides, those who quote Spinoza, those who cite Franz Rosenzweig, and those who look to Zionism. For certain writers, like the historian Simon Rabidovich, Jewish history has never been anything other than a history of survival, a chronicle of a, quote, ever-dying people and a people constantly on the verge of ceasing to be or disappearing. Meanwhile, scholars such as David Beale, a well-known Jewish historian, have spoken of the more proximate transformations of a no less extensive history. After the Holocaust, says Beale, a new ideology of survival revived the old ideology of divine election as the basis for Jewish life, decisively altering the Jewish politics of the new state of Israel and the diaspora community in America. In a notable remark from late 1969, Hannah Arendt links this, quote, survival business back to the book of Nehemiah and to the survival passion which has possessed this people since antiquity and has actually made it survive. More recently, the Israeli historian Benny Morris has confirmed that Jews are, quote, one of the few people from ancient times who have managed to more or less survive and endure into the 21st century. A comparable sentiment also underlies the work of the American Jewish historian David Myers, who characterizes the dialectic between, quote, professional integrity and Jewish survival as the central tension animating the writing of Jewish history. There is perhaps no denying the simple and obvious truth, as one other scholar has put it, that Jewish politics really begins with the question of survival. But beginnings, of course, are always problematic, usually deceptive and sometimes treacherous. As some of you may have already been thinking, the Bible, of course, was not written in English. But even if you look at the King James Bible, it says next to nothing about survival, survivors, or surviving. These are some comparative passages from the ones I just showed you. Not until the immediate post-war period, with the publication and dissemination of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible in 1952, would these prevailing interpretive choices give way to a more pervasive and more unified survivalist lexicon. Since then, the language of survival has only ramified, now appearing throughout the text of many English Bibles and translating a series of Hebrew terms for both Jewish and Christian readers alike. My point then is that the decision to begin may actually begin with a decision to translate. Take the Hebrew expression nitzol hashalah and its English equivalent, the Holocaust survivor. As Edith Zertal has argued, the rabbinic word nitzol, meaning saved, does not bear the semantic charge delivered by the words survivor in English and survivant in French. The same can be said of the phrase she'erita pleita, survivors, remaining survivors, which in the post-war years emerged as a biblical anchor for the travails of Jewish survival. There is finally the intervening force of the Latin Vulgate, where two passages alluded to earlier allude already to the divided legacy of survival's two possible etymological sources. The word survival's two possible etymological sources, superstare and supervivere. In the first, Jacob says to Joseph, I can die now, having seen for myself that you are still alive. This is superstitem. The second one, again, reads, if the slave survives using supervivere, a day or two, there is no punishment. When it comes to the genealogy of survival, I'm trying to say, a great deal rides on the history of the word survival, how one defines it, how one traces its particular constellation of meanings, and how one locates it within a scrambled matrix of discursive asymmetries, linguistic hegemonies, and translational imperatives. Again, survival's beginnings may have a lot to do with where one decides to begin. So I ask my question again, who is speaking about survival if the Bible is a false start? Let me tell a little bit of a different story, beginning again in English in America and with the rise of the survivor as a so-called secular saint. As Peter Novick and others have argued, the post-war era in America attests to a remarkable set of changes in the perception and valorization of what is only recently consolidated into the, quote, shocking, massive, and distinctive thing now known as the Holocaust. The Eichmann trial, so the popular story goes, was the first time that American audiences found themselves exposed to the Holocaust as a discrete event separated out from the wider context of Nazi destruction. A series of political and cultural incidents, including the October War in 1973, the television series Holocaust, and the establishment of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, further contributed to the production of the Holocaust as an American memory. This, again, is a story that's been kind of widely told in the literature and the post-war period. The emergence of the survivor was a crucial stage in this narrative, one summed up in striking fashion by the oft-cited words of the author Werner Weinberg. Immediately after the war, we were liberated prisoners. In subsequent years, we were included in the term DPs, or displaced persons. In the US, we were sometimes generously called New Americans. Then for a long time, there was a good chance that we as a group might go nameless. But one day I noticed that I had been reclassified as a survivor. Students of American culture have framed this transformation as a shift from victim to survivor, whereby those formerly identified as the passive, silent, and weak objects of Nazi aggression gradually became figures endowed with agency, speech, and power, capable of moving from the realms of exclusion and invisibility to public recognition and moral authority. According to one familiar rendition of this argument, early attitudes toward victims showed a profound ambivalence, combining a contempt for their supposed lack of resistance with a simultaneous reverence for the redemptive virtues of their suffering and death. Those who had managed to display some degree of defiance often found themselves accused of collaboration in bringing about the death of others. With time, this image began to change, such that once demonized examples of the worst could become celebrated as symbols of courage, heroism, and virtue. Major public events like the Eichmann trial positively differentiated survivors from victims for the first time by imbuing only the former with the new social function of juridico-historical witness. This is, again, a line of argument. This revaluation would lead to the construction of the Holocaust as an occasion for feelings of pride. It meant that one could stress the survivor's triumph over death, as well as re-signify the meaning of survival more generally, divesting it of its collaborationist connotations and accepting it as an exceptional accomplishment. Now, matters are significantly more complicated than this linear chronology would suggest, as my study as a whole attempts to show. The basic outline, however, does go some way towards specifying the various factors that have contributed to the production and dissemination of the survivor, this word survivor, as a recognizable figure. One could think here of the early medical work done by psychiatrists and Freudian psychoanalysts, such as William Niederland, on the emotional disorders suffered by those who had spent time in the concentration camps. Over the course of the 1960s, Niederland and others undertook clinical research into the so-called problem of the survivor, eventually identifying survivor syndrome as a distinctive diagnostic category. In his 1968 summary of the issue, Niederland isolated a series of archetypical symptoms, ranging from anxiety, depression, and psychosis to loss of personal identity, psychosomatic disturbance, and the feelings of being a ghost or a living corpse. The psychiatric contribution to the, quote, issue of survival found its most far-reaching extension in the work of Robert J. Lifton. By the time Niederland was outlining his theory of survivor syndrome, Lifton had already begun his immense research into the general psychology of the survivor, where he developed a broad comparison between Hiroshima and other extreme historical experiences, including the destruction wrought by the plagues in 14th century Europe. In sum, he says, we can define the survivor as one who has come into contact with death in some bodily or psychic fashion and has himself remained alive. Like Niederland, Lifton would go on to specify a number of characteristics common to the survivor experience: the sense of being bound to images of destruction, feelings of guilt, loss of emotion, and the struggle to give meaning to one's experience or reestablish the form of a moral world. In the end, what Lifton discovered was that these categories describe not only the effect of a particular historical experience, but also a set of universal psychological tendencies. Across time and space, as Lifton once put it, the survivor becomes everyman. Lifton eventually saw fit to organize his findings into a singular and universally applicable concept of the survivor. But this was not before the psychologization of survival itself had come under suspicion. Famously, in a 1976 book entitled The Survivor, the literary critic Terence Dupre argued that the Holocaust had given, quote, rise to the survivor as a significant human type. For the first time, Dupre explained, the simple struggle for life had occurred beyond the compulsions of culture and in a context stripped of the normal institutions and structuring symbols of civilization. This experience brought to light not psychological guilt, as others had argued, but, quote, a biologically determined talent long suppressed by cultural deformation, a bank of knowledge embedded in the body's cells. In a hostile response to Dupre's affirmative biologism, Bruno Bettelheim defended the psychological importance of guilt as the most significant aspect of survivorship. Guilt, he said, arises not from the commission of a crime, but from the ability to know that one must not acquiesce in the evils of a concentration camped world, must not buy one's own life at the expense of the lives of others. Guilt and responsibility, not the celebration of mere survival, is what Bettelheim thought makes us human. From the psychological to the biological to the ethical, the problem of the survivor had become a divisive issue by the 1970s, the topic of heated debate and disciplinary conflict. But the feud between Bettelheim and Dupre conceals more than it reveals. In its narrow focus on the Holocaust, it includes the survivor's vast proliferation as a comparative figure of extreme situations. The real question, says the scholar Edith Hall, much more recently, may be how the, quote, noun survivor came to be applied in an ontological sense to anybody who had committed or suffered anything involving trauma, and by extension to the ontological status of virtually everyone. For Christopher Lasch, the kind of conservative critic, the profusion meant reflecting on the creation of a more general culture of survivalism, in which everyday life had begun to pattern itself on the survival strategies forced on those exposed to extreme adversity. It's kind of a popular line of criticism in the 70s. Many have attempted to account for the transformation of survival from a sign of the extreme to an element of the everyday. Observers have sometimes underscored the tremendous impact of the women's movement on the recognition of sexual abuse as a traumatic memory comparable to the experience of Holocaust survivors. Another parallel story emphasizes the role played by Vietnam veterans in gaining acceptance of PTSD as an official mental disorder. In the wake of survivor syndrome, Lifton and others suggested that these soldiers had been consumed by the same survivor guilt as the Jewish and Japanese survivors. It is a critical development, as others have showed, in the militarization of a term that has increasingly combined perpetrators and victims of violence into a single single generic category. None of this, though, carries the weight of the apocalyptic thinking and siege mentality of the Cold War. The anthropologist Joseph Moskow has demonstrated that the, quote, nuclear danger became a complex new political ideology, specifically aimed at engineering the population's effective response to the threat of mass ruination. Already by the early 1950s, the Eisenhower administration had begun efforts to prepare its citizenry for the nuclear crisis by creating a, quote, program of psychological defense aimed at feelings that would unify the nation in the face of apocalyptic everyday threat. Although the propaganda campaign took a number of forms, probably none were more spectacular than Operation Q, which on May 5th, 1955, this is according to Moscow's account, gave 100 million Americans the opportunity to watch live on television a typical suburban community blown to bits by an atomic bomb. The motto, survival is your business. And business in this sense has continued. One need only think of Hollywood and the yearly techno-aesthetic displays that still allow Americans to survive their own destruction with fetishistic glee. And this is Moscow's interpretation. Popular media have no doubt served as a major vehicle in survival's fluid movement across seemingly disparate contexts and discursive domains. In one sardonic critique, Larry David stages a vicious debate between an elderly Holocaust survivor and a winner of the television series Survivor. The feuding parties duel over the question, who has the most rightful claim to the title? Elsewhere, cinema theorist Carol Clover situates survival within the shifting gender dynamics of the modern slasher film. As she shows, the camera in these movies almost always sets its male gaze upon a distressed, quote, final girl, who through a sheer will to survive, manages to overcome an experience of horror and live on as the movie's sole survivor. From a different angle, the anthropologist Talal Asad asks viewers of contemporary visual culture to recognize their implicit identification with the suffering, endurance, and healing of a male hero. In the era of Abu Ghraib, this, quote, neat conceit has sometimes taken the form of a CIA agent who survives torture and then moves on to discover the truth of his mission in a kind of profound irony. But the irony here is that survival's capacity to transform abjection into power, as some of the narratives about the Holocaust have it, also makes it a cunning dissimulating mechanism for the transformation of power into abjection. Interesting work on the serial killer, for example, from the 1990s, has included the deadly logic of the survivor to portray murderous acts of violence as triumphant moments of self-defense. Consider on another level the renewed applicability of survival guilt to veterans of America's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Beyond its success or failure as a palliative device for individual suffering and its relationship to things like PTSD and so forth, the phrase has had, in the articles that have been written about this, the curious rhetorical advantage of recoding and disavowing the overwhelming presence of American imperialism, permitting guilt over the loss of friends and reticence over the death of enemies. One other relevant iteration is the spread of doomsday thinking and lavish bunker building among the wealthiest of elites. The gilded apocalypticism of the words survival of the richest, which was in a New Yorker from a couple of years ago, is just another reminder of the inversions and transpositions that support an inclination toward neutralization and depoliticization. Now, there is more to say about survival's uses and abuses in post-war America. But at this point, the history I've been sketching could risk advancing a case for American exceptionalism. And that's why it's important to take a global, by which I mean globalizing, perspective on this pressing issue. After all, the search for survival's beginnings has regularly brought scholarship to 19th century England, and its convoluted combination of Romanticism, Malthusianism, and Darwinism, imaginings of the last man, ideas about population, and slogans like survival of the fittest have offered vocabulary and conceptual resources for the emergence of biopolitics and catastrophic thinking in the time of the Anthropocene. A more capacious evaluation of survival in European intellectual history would follow the chains of transmission that move these lines of thought through a series of other names, from Michelet to Mary Shelley, figures like E.B. Tyler, Marcel Proust, Walter Benjamin, Maurice Blanchot, Elias Canetti, W.G. Sebald, and so forth. If Jacques Derrida is right, this literary philosophical lineage bears directly upon a set of planetary concerns, where the figure of the survivant, the survivor, evokes the question of human rights facing all beings, human or not, living in a world that is, quote, more inegalitarian than ever. On this scale, one could recall the work of Willy Brandt in establishing an independent commission on international development issues. In 1977, the former chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany tasked the group with investigating the global problems, quote, arising from the economic and social disparities of the world community. The commission promised to set forth guidelines aimed at allaying the vast structural inequalities dividing a wealthy, economically and technologically developed global north from an increasingly impoverished and still economically underdeveloped global south. This was the goal of the report. When published in 1980, the Brandt report fulfilled this objective by proposing political and economic avenues for a more symmetrical reorganization of the North-South divide. But in doing so, the final report also advocated the construction of a new global morality based on what appears to be the simplest common interest, quote, that mankind wants to survive, and one might even has the moral obligation to survive. Thus, the official title of the report, North-South, a Program for Survival. The question is whether another ethics of survival could result in strategies that resist the tendency of markets and states to reduce all human beings to mere life. Brandt's report is one leading manifestation of survival's intersection with a set of global apprehensions, real global apprehensions about statelessness, refugees, concentration camps, border walls, climate crises, racial capitalism, neoliberalism, and other economies of abandonment. And of course, one could include the COVID crisis, which was not in the book version of this. What is telling is that this growing list of predicaments has frequently led back to the continued symbolic power of the Jewish survivor. This is true of intellectual historians like Carolyn Dean, as well as political theorists like Robert Meister, for whom the, quote, global politics of human rights after Auschwitz is still about the Jews. Meister's argument is that the protocols governing the survival of the Jews have made the Holocaust a virtual shibboleth for the acceptance of others into a universal discourse on human rights. The most important consequence of this politics of survival is the paradoxical rhetoric surrounding the defense of the Israeli state. In the name of Jewish survival, says Meister, Western institutions have classified the state of Israel as an exception to the norms of human rights, and look the other way when it bombs civilians in Hebron, Jenin, and Lebanon, and detains large numbers of Palestinians without trial. Talal Assad again summarizes the situation by noting the Israeli state's ideological interest in representing itself as the symbolic survivor of genocidal experience. Through the looking glass of Jewish survival, Palestinians become, quote, the present representatives of Nazi exterminism, and Israelis the protector of human rights. There's likely no better display of this geopolitical configuration than the stunning act of biblical exegesis performed by the Israeli Prime Minister for the United States Congress in March 2015. The speech seized the book of Esther, again going back to the Bible, as the theological political setting in which the persecution of Jews in ancient Persia becomes the threat of nuclear annihilation by modern Iran. The government of modern Iran becomes the political regime of Nazi Germany, and the experience of Holocaust survivors becomes a lesson about the survival of the state of Israel. So this modern itinerary that I've sketched here in all too quick a fashion could lead one back to the question, again, who is speaking about survival? My somewhat repetitive insistence on this question should suggest something about what I'm calling the genealogical objective of this study. Its central purpose is not to affirm or deny survival. It's not to accept or reject its rhetoric, or to say yes or no to the stances it defines, to be for or against it. Following Michel Foucault, I take genealogy to be an attempt to gauge the fact that survival, quote, is spoken about, to discover who does the speaking, the positions and viewpoints from which they speak, the institutions which prompt people to speak about it, and which store and distribute the things that are said. I understand genealogy as a methodological scheme for provincializing the presumed universality of regnant codes, for analyzing the text of dominant discourses, and for exposing how speech that has not always been self-evident to everyone, as in the case of the biblical examples I've been giving, has been made to look obvious and even universal. This is another way of saying that genealogy is a science of beginnings. To write a genealogy of survival is not to write a history of survival, but instead to ask where such a history might begin. What are survival's limits? What are its archives? What are its languages? And what field of translations mediate its generalization? The genealogy that I present in the book is therefore, and at best, a kind of prolegomenon to a history that has not yet been written. However restricted and however partial, these aspirational constraints acknowledge the need for a preparatory inventory of the major questions, texts, and structures of speaking that have made survival and the figure of the survivor an identifiable element of our current political horizon as a useful form of vocabulary, say, for talking about a whole host of different issues. My preliminary hypothesis is that the genealogy of survival begins with the specific political and theological political anxieties surrounding the survival of the Jews. In choosing this point of departure, I'm not arguing for a direct and transparent return to the Jewish textual tradition, but rather for a more complex encounter with the vicissitudes of history and translation that have contributed to the adoption of this language by both Jews and others. Robert Meister, again, motions in a helpful direction by speculating that the political prominence of Jewish survival is as much about Jews as it is about the Christian West and the history of the Jewish question that goes as far back as Paul. Quote, why are there still Jews? According to Meister, the recognizability of the Jew as survivor, again in quotes, signals the ongoing influence of a hyphenated Judeo-Christian tradition upon the terms of global human rights discourse. Survival reveals the theological political rules that govern the history of secular Judeo-Christianity and mark the Judeo-Christian character of our secularism. The insight could take the genealogy of survival in a number of directions. On the one hand, a shared concern with Jewish survival could serve as a means of reconciling the commonalities of a Judeo-Christian tradition that runs from the Bible until today. On the other hand, survival could also be an opportunity to explore the historical grammar of concepts underlying the secular's unique organization of power and discipline. Critics of secularism like Talal Asad have argued, for instance, that the Judeo-Christian heritage assumed by modern secularity is actually a retrospective reconstruction whose vision of unity has particular political stakes, i.e. the grammatical exclusion of Muslims. The problem is that neither Meister nor Assad can fully divest themselves of the suspicion that the secular embrace of a Judeo-Christian past is the reiteration of an older Christian perspective on the theological place of the Jews in Christendom. This is because both know that far from being a simple term of reconciliation, or in fact, a sort of post-genocidal consolation prize, the Judeo-Christian has often functioned as a supersessional redescription of Christianity itself, a duplicitous attempt to suppress the polemical asymmetries that have long characterized the history of Jewish-Christian difference and debate. The very idea of a secular Judeo-Christian civilization would be the end and not the beginning of a protracted Christian mission to erase, deny, and redeem the anti-Christian elements at the center of pre-modern Jewish discourse. In this light, I approach Jewish survival neither as a Jewish nor as a Judeo-Christian question, but instead as a counterintuitive index for the way survival refracts the secularized forms of Christianity that mark modernity in the West. Now, visions of this claim are by now familiar, at least in the fields that I work in. Few philosophers of religion, notes Leanne Carlson, would be surprised to learn that Christianity provides, quote, the inescapable backdrop to all Western philosophy, at least in the modern period. The statement applies as much to individual thinkers explicitly involved in projects of de-theologization as it does to more abstract and far-reaching endeavors to unearth the theological traces at play, say, in modern political economy. And yet, the stark obviousness of Christianity's significance has not necessarily led to any further clarity on the kind of object or subject that Christianity is. At times, even the most sophisticated genealogical work struggles to contain the slippages between Christianity and a host of other historically freighted terms, not the least of which is the word religion. The awful truth, says Gil Anijar, is that we have yet to formulate, yet to attain anything like an adequate concept of Christianity. Worse still is the possibility that we do not know whether there is such a thing as a Christian question. After Assad and others, Anijar has argued that generalizing categories like the religious and the secular are not universally applicable concepts, but translations that a protean Christian tradition has used to define, divide, and sometimes mask the extent of its own operations. Religion, he writes, is the result of a tradition and name which Christianity gave itself, part of a style of thought which elaborated over centuries in order to achieve some degree of unity. By continuing to speak of itself as a religion, Christianity has engaged in a strategic essentialism, where the secular marks a fundamental break with the past and not its internal transformation or furtive expansion. If we need a concept of Christianity, it is because we need a concept that analyzes Christianity as a singular structure of possible actions, an enactment of essential divisions, and a distribution across a hierarchical differential of power. This might mean the religious and the secular, theology and race, politics and economy, humanitarianism and civilizing mission, Orientalism and anti-Semitism, church and state, medieval and modern, just to name some other popular divisions used in contemporary scholarship. For my purposes here, I read Anijar as the most evocative interpreter and amplifier of an idea that Jacques Derrida introduced under the somewhat difficult term global Latinization. In distinction to concepts like secularization and de-theologization, Derrida's neologism, in French mondialatinisation, manages to capture in a single gesture the indistinguishability of Latin Christianity from the centuries-long process of universalization and, quote, hyper-imperialist appropriation, now called globalization. The term, on my reading at least, stands along a chain of other signifiers in Derrida's grammatological lexicon: Western metaphysics, white mythology, phallogocentrism, concerned with the problem of historical closure. As Gayatri Spivak puts it in another context, not a general problem, but a European problem, or a Christian program that has erased within itself the fabulous scene that has produced it and mistaken its own idiom for a universal idiom. Global Latinization, in this sense, marks out the essentially Christian itinerary of translation and Latinization that has guided the name religion from Rome to Europe and the United States, and into the conceptual apparatus of international law and global political rhetoric. The point, I think, is to stay vigilant against too great a claim for transparency and to remain aware of the contours of a conceptual maneuver, a historical conceptual maneuver that may have no meaning outside the history of Christianity. What this also implies is that the question I've been asking, who is speaking about survival, cannot ignore the fact that the name survival, as with the name religion, we are already speaking Latin. The genealogy of survival begins, therefore, as an investigation into the differences disseminated across a history of translation as it has made its way from Rome to Europe to the United States, and has imposed itself within the apparatuses of a worldwide global Latinization. It is from this perspective that I pursue Jewish survival as a cipher for that shocking, massive, and distinctive catachresis known as Judeo-Christianity. As the late anthropologist Saba Mahmoud might have said, survival is, quote, symptomatic of the fundamental centrality of Christian norms, values, and sensibilities, however Judaic they are made out to be, to European conceptions of what it means to be secular. So that's the kind of framework. So how do I do this? Against this background, that I read a series of writers who have willingly or otherwise made pivotal contributions to the building up of survival's archive. These figures are Hannah Arendt, Walter Benjamin, Franz Rosenzweig, and Sigmund Freud. In choosing this canonical library of names, I'm compelled by two textual strategies. First, because the work of Arendt, Rosenzweig, and Freud has been so central to the post-war expression of Jewish survival, their writings are effective sites for its provisional disarticulation. Second, because the writings of Arendt, Benjamin, and Freud have circulated well beyond the discourse on Jewish survival and become major resources in the propagation of survival talk across geographic and topical context, they can also serve as occasions for a further global Latin reorientation of survival's theological political archive. The selected readings I attempt here seek to turn the dominant interpretive traditions of survival inside out by showing that they always already inscribe the notion of survival with the theological political legacy of Latin Christianity. These various genealogical strands weave a history of subjectivity and sovereignty, mysticism and spectrality, as it coheres around the body of Christ, crucified, resurrected, and multiplied, and as it produces an ambivalent supplement in the mysterious body of Israel. It is a tradition, I argue, that continues to condition the way an increasingly global Latinizing Christianity defines, differentiates, and disseminates itself. One last point before I conclude. Like some other writers in the kind of larger tradition of political theology and secularization, I assume that history is a regressive enterprise. And I endorse Talal Asad's wager that genealogy presents a particularly potent way of working back from our present to the contingencies that have come together to give us our certainties. So in that sense, the book actually works backward. I begin with Arendt in the 1950s and use these readings moving backward through the first half of the 20th century to orient a series of readings about the theological political archive, ranging back at times to Shakespeare and to figures like Pseudo-Dionysius and others. The text that I gave you, just to say one point about it, was a portion of the chapter on Franz Rosenzweig. And the third chapter essentially attempts to articulate a difference within German between two words, Überleben and Fortleben, two different possible words for thinking about survival in German. Against conventional appraisals of his text as a theology of Jewish survival, I demonstrate that its division between Überleben and Fortleben maps a tension between two discrete narratives of Christian survival. One that constructs a theological political anthropology around the body of Christ, and one, and this was something I do in the article, and one that rehearses the Augustinian history of Jewish witness, the Jews as living witnesses to Christianity. I also show, and this was, I don't believe in the article version I sent you, that Rosenzweig introduces a third term with a strange neologism, übersterben, or outdying. And consistent with an old Orientalist tradition on the nature of despotism, Rosenzweig deploys the term as a polemical marker of the connection between Islam and death. And I connect this, these fundamentally, discriminations between Christ the Jew and the Muslim as a kind of theological political archive that helps explain some of what's going on in Giorgio Agamben's well-known text on remnants of Auschwitz. At any rate, kind of fragmented readings are an attempt to build up a partial genealogy of this notion of survival. Before, in the end, I come to an epilogue where I try to think about the political implications of survival and the question of Jewish survival in contemporary Palestine, and the kind of colonial inflections of the uses of survival in that context. Okay, I'm gonna stop here. Hopefully I haven't taken up too much of everybody's time, but perhaps we can talk a little bit about all of this. And I'll, at least for a moment, I'll leave up the presentation, the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. We normally, yeah, sort out about a half hour or so for Q&A, which Adam is invited here. I'm not sure what people are seeing on their screens. I think it was just you for me.
I can stop the share for the moment if that's helpful.
Actually, I had changed it to just you, so now I'm seeing a few more people, which is helpful for me. But
okay.
I'm happy to start just to ask what inspired this project, or kind of, it feels like there's quite a tour, and curious where in there did you begin?
Right, so I gave you all the kind of difficult version of this. The book begins with a preface, actually, that makes this a little bit easier. But basically what I was interested in when I first started was, on the one hand, the kind of ubiquity of, within the restricted domain of Jewish studies, the kind of use of survival, both politically related to contemporary politics surrounding, stuff related to Israel and Palestine, but also related to the Holocaust. And then also this question that one sees come up often in sort of classical Jewish historical literature on the, quote, survival of the Jews. At the same time, I was interested in some philosophical debates going on within continental philosophy about survival, the figure of the survivor, and so forth, as well as the kind of general use of the survivor and the question of survival as a kind of political term of identification, where it came from, how we understand it in our contemporary political horizon. And the question for me was whether these two things could be brought together, whether this kind of secular use of survival could be brought together with this question about Jewish survival. And my answer is that, well, actually, it has to do with these complex questions about the secularization of Christianity and the kind of political theology of Christianity, both surrounding the Jewish question and then its influence on philosophical political debates more generally. So that was the kind of origin of the project. I think I've left everybody in silence.
So I'll jump in if I don't. Sorry, I'm not seeing everyone on my screen right now.
Yeah.
So, all right, can you all hear me? Okay, so this is a super cool project, and I look forward to reading the book. This is all just a ton to sort of think about and try to put together. I'm really intrigued.
Yeah.
Just bringing together so many different levels of analysis. So I have, and this just came to kind of a polemical question, which I wouldn't fully subscribe to. We're kind of curious to see how you would respond to this challenge, right? Yeah. You kind of start off by making this claim that essentially a lot of contemporary discourse, especially surrounding human rights, let's say, sort of international, development politics, you referenced to Willy Brandt, sort of goes back to this sort of issue of Jewish survival, right? And then you sort of the genealogy through these sort of canonical Jewish and Rosenzweig, Benjamin, and Freud. Right? So it's a kind of overdetermination issue, right? Where in some sense, your own argument about this lineage of sort of this discourse of Jewish survival then kind of leads you to see that discourse in all of these sort of other places. But for instance, when I think about like the sort of contemporary human rights, you know, politics and movement, right? It doesn't seem to me, at least, that it's sort of blinded by this kind of obsession with Israeli survival, but contrary, actually, has been a sort of crucial tool for Palestinian organizations to kind of advance their claims. And I think Holocaust studies has become quite kind of dissociated from the people who study human rights precisely because of these kinds of political divides. So it seems a lot to kind of claim that human rights are overdetermined by this genealogy of Jewish survival, despite one sort of strand within the world of Jewish studies would probably think of it that way. So I'm just curious kind of how you situate yourself in relation to that kind of question of over-determining the argument. But this is not to kind of attack I mean, I think this is super fascinating, but I'm just,
No, attack away.
It pops into my head.
Right, it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon, but it seems like there are actually two questions here. One is a question that I get a lot, which is the choice of text that I use and whether that's kind of overdetermined somehow. And the second question is this about this link between Holocaust discourse, human rights discourse, and whether that is also overdetermined in a kind of different way. So two things. One is, as I tried to say, the choice of my texts, well, people often ask me about this, why I chose Freud, Benjamin, Rosenzweig, etc. I could give examples from each of them, but Freud is perhaps the easiest. And the degree to which the emergence of the survivor as a concept runs through post-war Freudian discourse, and the degree to which it relies on certain readings of Freudian texts makes for a kind of interesting question, which is the concept survival even a psychoanalytic concept, or is it a Freudian concept? And the short answer is that it's not really. I mean, it's not a concept like sublimation. It's not a concept like the unconscious or repression. It's a term that various post-war, a few pre-war, mostly post-war psychoanalysts have used to corral a whole number of different issues in order to create a certain discourse on this figure of the survivor's question of survival. And so the strategy in that case is to go back to Freud and try to actually read him in a place where he does talk in these terms, namely about Überleben, and see what's actually going on there. And it provides an opportunity for, as I said, reorienting the kinds of historical narratives we're telling. And the same, I think, can be said of people like Benjamin and Rosenzweig in different ways. So the choice of these figures is overdetermined, but in a way that I think is strategically important. One other thing to say, especially if you think about kind of canonical figures in trauma studies like Kathy Carruth, is that when they write about the question of survival, and they write about it in relationship to people like Freud, they're often reading something like Moses and monotheism. So the entire thing gets wrapped up with a discourse on Jewish survival. So in a sense, it's already overdetermined, and I'm trying to unpack that overdetermination. On the question of the Holocaust and human rights, yeah, I mean, I think you're right in part. I think Meister, in his who I'm following here, is concerned kind of on an institutional level, where I think that link is maybe more apparent than on some more grassroots levels, where I think what you're saying is correct. On the other hand, sort of mentor, colleague of mine, Carolyn Dean at Yale, a kind of great intellectual historian, has just written a book on the concept of the witness, the juridical use of the witness. And in her narrative, like a lot of these narratives, she tries to displace the Holocaust, and yet in doing it, she just kind of places it back at the center of the emergence of human rights discourse. So I think there's a kind of tension, you're right, Brandon, but the narrative keeps reiterating itself in certain ways. so yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Go for it, Hank.
So it sounds like a really interesting book. And forgive me for asking a question that doesn't have enough familiarity with it. But I was wondering if you could speak to the way in which the kind of genealogical deconstructive elements in the text work together with the political side of the text. So here's a worry. And it's a worry that, got voiced, back in the 1980s already by Bruno Latour, and has been all the more pronounced today, which is this sort of deconstructive genealogical approach leads into a kind of post-truth kind of framework that complicates political engagement. And Derrida received countless criticisms on this front. And this is what pushes Derrida into sort of saying, no, I'm all for a Kantian ideal. I love the Enlightenment. And then people would say, well, how do you do that? It doesn't seem like you have the footwork to stand on. And so, like, how do those moments of the text come together? And one thing, just sort of looking at the sort of figures that you're drawing together in a really neat way, is you are pulling in folks like Hannah Arendt and Walter Benjamin, who are decidedly in a broadly kind of, Enlightenment narrative. And Benjamin himself, in the work of art as mechanical reproduction, is like criticizing modernity for displacing this like engagement with like presence itself. So it seems like there's supposed to be some foothold in something like nature, even though that term's problematic, in opposition to something like culture, even though that's problematic, to sort of anchor it from just sort of spiraling into kind of deconstructive semiotics. Like, how do those elements come together in your book?
Okay, great. So I was actually watching a lecture recently from a couple of years ago with this issue of Derrida and post-truth came up, and it's funny because it reminds me of these debates from again, as you said, in the 1980s about the representation of the Holocaust, where somehow in some sort of bizarre philosophical U-turn, Derrida and a bunch of other followers in post-colonialism and so forth become the kind of bear the philosophical responsibility for like the extermination of Jews in Europe. And I find it quite bizarre and maybe telling in a different way that this was that this is kind of constantly reiterated in different ways, that deconstruction is at fault for giving us post-truth, and hence maybe Donald Trump or something like that. I think Latour's concerns are interesting. The critique of modernity, I'm less interested in, because I'm actually trying to critique something that isn't modern at all, that is actually pre-modern and continues into modernity. But my concern about the figure of the survivor and the question with survival isn't. I don't think it's really a question of truth. It's a question of what are the best political categories we use for articulating a set of demands, and is the survivor a particularly good one? Is it helpful? Does it coordinate and structure the kinds of political fault lines that I want? So just to give an example, and this comes out more clearly in the epilogue, aside from what survival means, it often creates this kind of strange framework where you have kind of Jews and Christians on the one side and Muslims on the other side, or you have Israel and you have Palestine. And I propose in the conclusion that actually there are other forms of vocabulary, other possible figures and concepts that we could use that would break apart the kind of roteness or obviousness of the way that survival functions. So it's not, as I said as well, I'm not for or against survival. I think it's a useful term. I think it represents something. I think it describes things in a certain way. I just want to describe things in a different way, and part of the way I'm trying to do that is by suggesting that this language actually has a particular history to it. Just one example before I stop. Arendt actually in the German version of her Origins book reminds us that the survivor didn't begin in the post-war period with the victims of the Holocaust. It began, it began before that, but it was used during the war period by Goebbels and Hitler to talk about the survival of the Nazi Reich, and why that term would then become the term used to represent victims, another possible option, is curious to me, especially considering the social Darwinist history of survival. So anyway, I know it's a little bit rambling, but hopefully that answers some of your post-truth concerns at least.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
A little heretical comment. In the end, we always end up with the same texts.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to hear from you a little bit. So when you started out, I took a few notes and I thought, hey, that's a cool trajectory. And as you said, it's actually pre-modern. You start with ancient text, you're rereading the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
And what you sent out, or what David sent out, was a rereading of Rosenzweig, who is a classic, but certainly in the shadow of Benjamin and Arendt. Why do we end up with these figures and something that I thought you opened more, it was wider,
yeah,
the way I heard it in the beginning, and then it goes through the needle's eye of the same text. We always, they are important, but I'd like to hear from you a little bit about your own trajectory in your work. You developed this enormous methodological apparatus to make sure that we can reread these texts. But can you tell us a little more about how did you end up with those?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is I agree with you. Ending up with the same text. But I think there's a methodological kind of bind that I find myself in, or found myself in. As I was saying in response to Brandon's question, part of the reason to go back to these texts is precisely because they're canonical, precisely because they appear not just as the subjects of individual studies in intellectual history, but provide often theoretical, methodological resources in historical, anthropological, critical studies that go well beyond the context of their emergence. Sometimes if they're kind of or texts of contemporary theory. And so to go back into them and to attempt to suggest that they can point us in other directions is, on the one hand, boring, but maybe the necessary, boring, mechanical work that needs to be done. The second answer to your question is that the way I use these figures here is as kind of extremely narrow orienting points in order to tell the kind of wider story that I suggest in the introduction. In the sense that figures like Arendt in particular are already telling us kind of massive histories, and the resources, the elements that they use in their texts provide hints, as I said, to a kind of archive that still needs to be discovered. This archive of survival. Among additional figures that make their way into the book through these interpretations, Hamlet is major in chapter 4. As I said, Pseudo Dionysius makes an appearance. Joseph Conrad is an important touchstone for Hannah Arendt. St. Augustine for trying to understand the witness doctrine. So there are many other figures, many other texts, many other sites that help bring this sort of larger story together. My strategy was to use these individual texts, not even individual thinkers, just very close readings of particular books, particular essays, as a way to orient a story that I think otherwise would have gotten a little bit out of control. It needed some kind of anchoring mechanism in order to begin to tell the story that I wanted to tell.
Carl, did you have a question?
Well, sort of a muddled question. By the way, for the historical record, I used to shovel George Mossey's driveway, but
Wonderful.
That's for another time. What you begin with the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah.
We just seem to overlay that with Christianity. That it seems to in this false synthesis of the Judeo-Christian and then Derrida's view of Latinization. But what about the survival of, let's call it, Jewish theology, and survivors who sought to advance and continue Jewish theology? And to think of a figure, for example, that doesn't fit here, but may raise questions, would be like Leo Strauss.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a question.
Right. Right. I mean, I don't. Yeah. I mean, I've spent time with Strauss. I think he was not as helpful for this project. But I mean, it depends on what you mean by the survival of Jewish theology. I mean, certainly many thinkers have spoken in this way about Jewish history, Jewish theology. Especially in the 1960s, this was a kind of hot topic, the survival of Jewish theology and so forth. The question, the kind of problem I'm trying to suggest, and actually may go under the term Judeo-Christian, if in a partially false way, is how does one disarticulate the fact that on the one hand, there's a long Christian theological tradition concerned with the survival of the Jews, a kind of core of a particular strand of Christian theology, with discussion of the survival of the Jews in, say, modern Jewish texts. Are these two completely unrelated questions? Or does one need to find a way of, on a kind of level of vocabulary, disarticulate what's going on here? Survival, at least in, strictly speaking, is not a classic term of Jewish thought, either in the ancient period or the medieval period. So why is it that it becomes one in its rereadings of classical rabbinic texts in the modern period? And so part of the difficulty, and something I do in different places, the Arendt chapter, the Rosenzweig chapter, is try to think about the degree to which Jewish self-reflection in modernity may or may not emerge out of a tradition of Christian theology when it comes to terms like survival. So I'm posing it as a problem and a question of translation often.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the specific texts you're using of those classics?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I thought I still had the shared screen up. I apologize. I've been gesturing towards something that is invisible. You mean the major text that I read in each chapter?
Yeah, because you said you narrowed it down not so much to these thinkers, I mean, when you say you want to build this archive of survival, and then the pillars, the core readings or the core texts that require still ongoing exegesis. So what are the texts you kind of build this on?
Can everybody see that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the first chapter offers a reading of a kind of full reading of the origins of totalitarianism, which I think is actually something that happens pretty rarely. Usually people pick out individual sections, but to think of it as a kind of coherent book, and the way that the language of survival actually traverses its different sections, which is, and I've misspelled elementa here, I apologize. But there should be, what was I gonna say? That the language of survival actually goes across its sometimes motley divisions that people have had a hard time holding together, as well as a kind of interesting question of translation, to the extent that Arendt actually wrote two books, one published first in English, and then one that is only in the kind of simplest sense a translation. It's really a heavily edited, revised version of the book, and thinking a little bit about the different kinds of language that move across those two books as they appear in the early 1950s. Again, anti-Semitism, imperialism, and totalitarianism as the kind of three major categories in which Arendt uses the vocabulary of survival. The task of the translator is this, kind of cryptic text that Benjamin wrote. But what is interesting about it is that he posits a distinction, or at least seems to posit a distinction, between the two German words I mentioned in relationship to Rosenzweig, Fortleben and Überleben. And this has, I think, in continental philosophy, just kind of run amok at this point as a kind of distinction that has enabled all sorts of different reflections on things related to translation, but also related to politics, gender theory, and so forth. So it's become a kind of theoretical touchstone for thinking about survival. Rosenzweig I mentioned already. It kind of combines reflection on this anthropology of Christ's body related to the sort of Pauline texts and so forth. The Benjamin text, I actually don't write that much about. It's a way to get into how the emergence of the word survivor in English seems to come into being around the turn of the 17th century, and makes a prominent appearance in Hamlet. And I try to situate it into larger theological political debates about things like the king's two bodies, the Eucharist, and so forth. And so that chapter ends with an attempt to think about the survivor as a kind of figure of sovereignty emerging out of a particular theological political tradition. And then Freud, I kind of forego a reading of Moses and monotheism to read one particular dream, which I try to read against the biblical scene of Christ's empty tomb as a kind of fictional Freudian rewriting of that scene between death and resurrection. So all of these texts are different moments for identifying different sites of survival's formulation.
Well, I guess I have to read your book now.
Well, yeah, right.
So here's where I have kind of what's going through my head. So I think the project is fantastic. Yeah. So an archive of survival or a genealogy. I really like the rereading of sources. So the Holy Remnant, of course, Christian appropriation of this Hebrew topos. So there is a lot where I think, wow, that's, yeah, and the way you presented it, when you ran through pop culture, and Holocaust debates, of course, and broadening to, so who's a survivor? I thought there was really, the net was really widely cast. But what I'm instinctively almost have trouble with is that you then narrow it down, and the genealogy or the archive of survival is the same text we read in different contexts. We always, I mean, we have this, and how can you make sure that we don't have the same exegesis with these classics we already had in so many other arenas? So I would have, I mean, I'm excited about the project, but I want to see how you make that actually happen. I mean, can you give me a rereading of Walter Benjamins Das Kunstwerk im Zeitalter der technischen Reproduzierbarkeit?
Right. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
And there, of course, what we had earlier, what Hank kicked in with nature, of course, that is a critique of modernism, and that's what it stands for. So what are we doing? I mean, we don't have to do Benjamin now, but the point is that we read it already in a very, or it has a canonical place in a way we approach it. So you have to kind of explain why, or what's the rereading of the canon or of these classics you offer that are then crucial to build this archive of survival.
Okay, so let me give you an example. In the case of Benjamin, so a kind of simplistic but general way of describing what Benjamin is interested in concepts like aura and so forth in the work of art essay is basically a question of presence and absence, right? Which one could take, to be either a kind of generality, something that he's interested in from a particular philosophical tradition. What I try to suggest, though, is that what's somewhat strange, especially considering Benjamin's interests, is that the question of modernity in his text actually at one moment explicitly references and then leaves out the theological tradition where the question of presence and absence was most spectacularly enunciated, which is in theological debates about the Eucharist, and that the Eucharist as a kind of site for thinking about the difference between, or conflation of presence and absence, however you want to think about it, as well as multiplication, is another term Benjamin's interested in, opens up a kind of different theological political background on what Benjamin might be interested in. And I try to use that, using different sources to reconstruct how the term survivor itself actually emerges out of some of these debates, theological political debates about the Eucharist in pre-modernity. So that's one example. Whether it's a new reading or a rehearsal of a different kind of old reading, I don't know. But for the purposes of trying to understand the conceptual history or the genealogy of survival, I think that a text like Benjamin's opens up and closes down at the same time a certain tradition of thought that is helpful. And I could give examples from each of the chapters, but without giving a full paper or doing a full reading, it won't necessarily be convincing. I mentioned Pseudo-Dionysius a couple of times, a kind of another interesting figure. And I try to suggest in the reading of The Task of the Translator that Benjamin himself might actually be drawing on a history of translation, whereby certain terms get through a tradition of translation in the Latin actually turn into survival. So yeah, so I mean, it will depend, the success will depend on how convincing each individual reader finds my presentation. But the question of narrowness and generality is actually one of the things I was going for here, which was to provide narrow, specific readings of canonical text that nonetheless help reconstruct a much broader narrative. So that's the strategy, at least.
Well, so appetite for more.
That's all I can hope for.
Can't give us too much, otherwise we wouldn't read the book.
Right. There'd be no, right. I could just send it around as a PDF, which I probably should do, but whatever. I mean, unless there are any other questions, I guess I'll just say thank you to everybody for joining. I see people are getting started to leave, but I'm happy to talk about it more if anyone's interested. So just let me know.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us today. So
of course. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, I hope to see everybody.
Good. Yeah, I hope we'll get together when it warms up a little bit.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks again, David.
Wishing you well, Adam, on the launch of the book.
Stay warm, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate the invitation, David. It was fun.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Bye, Brenda.
So, but okay.